Welcome, friends, to the History of the World channel. I am your narrator, Ramus. Enjoy listening to the full history of the country of Germany. Do not forget to write your opinion in the comments, and we will proceed. Prehistoric Germany. Back in the Upper and Middle Paleolithic, Germany was a place of migration of the oldest hominids, Heidelberg man, Neanderthal. During the Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic eras, there were several developed Paleolithic cultures in Germany: Hamburg, Ahrensburg, Federmesser. In the Neolithic era, the territory of Germany was occupied mainly by representatives of the western branch of the culture of linear ribbon ceramics, the Resin culture, and its descendant, the Misselsburg culture. During this period, dolmens were actively being built in Germany. The Misselsburg culture is gradually being replaced by the funnel-shaped cup culture. The Bronze Age is associated with speakers of the most ancient Indo-European languages, although initially they were, apparently, the ancestors of Celto-Italic peoples, rather than Germanic ones. The culture of spherical amphorae, the Baden culture, the culture of funeral urn fields, etc. The ancestors of the Germans occupied mainly the northern part of Germany. However, starting from the Iron Age, the Celts are gradually being pushed out of Germany, partially assimilating them, especially in the south of Germany. The ancient era, Germanic tribes inhabited the territory of Central Europe as early as the first millennium BC. A fairly detailed description of their structure and way of life is given by Tacitus in the treatise Germany and Julius Caesar in Notes on the Gallic War. Linguistic studies conducted by D. Ring suggest that the separation of the Germanic peoples from the Baltoslavs occurred approximately in the 6th centuries BC. The Germans were divided into several groups. Between the Rhine, Main, and Weser lived Batavians, Bructerians, Hamavians, Huts, and Ubai. On the coast of the North Sea, Hawks, Angles, Varennes, Frisians. From the Middle and Upper Elbe to the Oder, Marcomanni, Quadi, Lombards, and Semnons. Between the Oder and Vistula, Vandals, Burgundians, and the Goths. In Scandinavia, Sveun, Gaut. Since the 2nd century AD, the Germans have been increasingly invading the Roman Empire. To the Romans, however, they were just barbarians. Gradually, they formed tribal alliances: Alemanni, Goths, Saxons, Franks. The Great Migration of Peoples. At the end of the 4th century, the invasion of Asian nomadic peoples in Europe prompted the resettlement of Germans. They settled the borderlands of the Roman Empire and soon began armed invasions of it. In the 5th century, Germanic tribes of Goths, Vandals, and others created their own kingdoms on the territory of the collapsing Western Roman Empire. At the same time, the primitive communal system was mostly preserved in the territory of present-day Germany for 1,000 years. In 476, the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by the German military commander Odoacer. Middle Ages, the Frankish state. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the most significant role among the Germanic tribes was played by the tribes of the Franks. In 481, Clovis I became the first king of the Salic Franks. Under him and his descendants, Gaul was conquered, and the Alemanni and most of the Frankish tribes joined the state from the Germans. Later, Aquitaine, Provence, northern Italy, a small part of Spain were conquered. The Thuringians, Bavarians, Saxons, and other tribes were subordinated. The Rusin culture existed in the interfluve of the Elbe and Zala in the 7th century. It correlates with the Lusatian Serbs, immigrants from the more southern, western Danubian lands. The Kurgan Rite did not spread in that part of the Elbe basin, where the wave of settlement of the Prague-Korzak culture was blocked by the migration of the Rusin tribes. By 800, the whole of Germany was part of a huge Frankish state. In 800, the Frankish king Charlemagne was declared Roman emperor. Until 800, the heiress of the Roman Empire was Byzantium, since the Western Roman Empire had already ceased to exist, and only the Eastern one remained, Byzantium. The empire restored by Charles was a continuation of the ancient Roman Empire, and Charles was considered the 68th emperor, the successor of the Eastern line immediately after Constantine VI was deposed in 797, and not the successor of Romulus Augustulus. In 843, the Frankish Empire collapsed, although various kings, more often the kings of Italy, intermittently formally bore the title of emperor until 924. The beginning of German statehood, 843-962. The East Frankish Kingdom. The origins of the German state are connected with the Treaty of Verdun, which was concluded in 843 by the grandsons of Charlemagne. This treaty divided the Empire of the Franks into three parts: the French, West Frankish Kingdom, inherited by Charles the Bald; the Italian Lorraine, Middle Kingdom, whose king was the eldest son of Louis the Pious; Lothair, and the German, where power went to Louis the German. Traditionally, the first German state is considered to be the East Frankish state. During the 10th century, the unofficial name Reich of the Germans, Regnum Teutonicorum, appeared, which after several centuries became generally recognized in the form of Reich der Deutschen. In 870, most of the Lorraine kingdom was conquered by the East Frankish king Louis the German. Thus, the East Frankish kingdom united almost all the lands inhabited by Germans. During the 9th to 10th centuries, wars with the Slavs took place, which led to the annexation of a number of Slavic lands. In 936, Duke Otto I of Saxony became the next East Frankish king. In the Russian historical tradition, he is called Otto. On August 10th, 955, German troops led by King Otto I defeated the Hungarian nomads who invaded Central Europe in the Battle of the Lech River and permanently stopped their devastating raids on Christian countries. The Holy Roman Empire, 962-1806, the early period of the Holy Roman Empire. On February 2nd, 962, Otto I was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. It was believed that he revived the empire of Charlemagne. But now the empire consisted mainly of Germany and part of Italy. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, Latin, Sacrum Imperium Romanum Nationis Germanicae, German. The Heiliges Römisches Reich Deutscher Nation was a political institution that maintained for 10 centuries, until 1806, the same form and the same claims. The external history of the empire is, in essence, the history of Germany from the 9th to the 19th century. By its origin, the Holy Roman Empire was ecclesiastical and Germanic. It was shaped by the enduring tradition of the universal dominion of eternal Rome. The Germanic and Roman elements, merging, determined the comprehensive and abstract character of the empire as the center and head of the Western Christian world. Under Frederick I Barbarossa of Hohenstaufen, who ruled in the 12th century, the first signs of feudal fragmentation appeared in the Holy Roman Empire. But under Frederick the Run and his son Henry VI, the empire still remained united and even expanded. However, after the death of Henry VI in 1197, an internecine war for power began in the empire. Frederick II, who became emperor in 1220, was forced to recognize the sovereign rights of secular and ecclesiastical rulers within the borders of their possessions within the empire. This was the reason for the appearance of many independent principalities on the territory of the empire. Some North German cities joined the Hansa, a military trade union that monopolized trade in the Baltic Sea. The Codex Balduineus contains the first image of the Assembly of Electors. The 7 electors elect Henry VII as emperor. Electors can be identified by their coats of arms, from left to right. Archbishops of Cologne, Mainz and Trier, Count Palatine of the Rhine, Duke of Saxony, Margrave of Brandenburg, and King of Bohemia. The Hohenstaufen dynasty came to an end after the death of Frederick II. The interregnum lasted for about 20 years, during which alliances of strong independent cities began to emerge in the empire. In 1273, a representative of the Habsburg dynasty became emperor. The first representatives of this dynasty no longer had the same influence as the Hohenstaufen and depended on the electors, local princes who had the right to choose the emperor. Emperor Charles IV, who belonged to the Luxembourg dynasty, issued the Golden Bull in 1356, which established the rights of the electors to choose the emperor, wage wars among themselves within the empire, but not against the emperor, and mint their own coin. Since the second quarter of the 15th century, the imperial throne has been permanently occupied by representatives of the Habsburg dynasty. At this time, the principalities of the empire were creating their own financial, judicial, and tax systems, as well as full-fledged armies. Germany in the Renaissance humanism originated in Germany in the 1430s, a century later than in Italy. A special role belonged to printing, the great invention of the mid-15th century, which was brewing in a number of countries, but was made in Germany by Johannes Gutenberg. Albrecht Dürer, also called Leonardo da Vinci from Germany, was also the best painter and graphic artist of that time. Germany, the birthplace of the Reformation, 1517-1648. The Reformation began with a speech in Germany in 1517, with his positions, or, as they were called, theses for discussion, by the Augustinian monk Martin Luther. The ideologists of the Reformation put forward theses that actually denied the need for the Catholic Church with its hierarchy and clergy in general. The Catholic sacred tradition was rejected, the Church's rights to land wealth were denied, etc. Both the attempt of chivalry and the attempt of the peasants to take advantage of religious ferment for a complete socio-political revolution were completely defeated. In 1532, the all-German penal code Carolina was published. Emperor Charles V was an opponent of the Reformation. However, many principalities and cities turned against him and started a war against their emperor. Eventually, in 1555, the Augsburg religious peace was concluded, according to which freedom of religion was proclaimed in the empire. For about 50 years after the signing of the Peace of Augsburg, Catholics and Protestants managed to coexist peacefully, but in 1618, the 30 Years' War began, which devastated Germany. The war ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, which significantly expanded the rights of the German princes. They even got the opportunity to conclude international treaties. As a result, the fragmentation of Germany was consolidated. The rise of Prussia, 1648, early 19th century. A map of the lands of Germany, published in Blau's Cosmography, 1657. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 led to a significant expansion of the possessions of the Electorate of Brandenburg, which had previously, in 1618, annexed the Duchy of Prussia. In 1701, the Brandenburgian Prussian state was named the Kingdom of Prussia. It was characterized by a rigid bureaucratic system and militarism. In Prussia and other East German states, there was a second edition of serfdom. On the other hand, it was in Prussia that Kant and Fichte laid the foundation for classical German philosophy. The most famous was Frederick II the Great. He was considered a supporter of an enlightened monarchy, abolished torture, and reorganized the army based on drill. Under him, Prussia participated in the War of the Austrian Succession, in the 7 Years' War, in the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Although the Austrian Habsburgs remained the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, their influence weakened, and Prussia took Silesia from Austria. East Prussia was not even considered an integral part of the empire. The Holy Roman Empire existed in a fragmented and weakened form until its dissolution in 1806. Before that, in 1801-1803, there was a process known as the Great Mediatization. During this process, which culminated in the adoption of the final decree of the Imperial Deputation, spring 1803, there was an enlargement of the states of the Holy Roman Empire and a radical reduction in their number, primarily due to the secularization of ecclesiastical states and the abolition of numerous imperial cities. Creation of a single state, 1806-1871. During the time of Napoleon. During the Napoleonic Wars, Germany remained a politically backward country. Feudal fragmentation persisted, serfdom existed, and medieval legislation was in effect everywhere. A number of German states had previously fought with revolutionary France with varying success. In the autumn of 1805, the War of the Third Coalition began, as a result of which Austria was defeated. The German Emperor, Franz II, who had just become Emperor of Austria in 1804, left the German throne under pressure from Napoleon. In July 1806, the Holy Roman Empire was abolished, and the Union of the Rhine was proclaimed instead. Under Napoleon, the number of German principalities was significantly reduced due to their unification. Many cities, which numbered over 80 during their heyday, also lost their independence. By 1808, the Union of the Rhine included all the states of Germany, except Austria, Prussia, Swedish Pomerania, and Danish Holstein. Half of Prussia's territory was taken away from her and partially joined the Rhenish Union. serfdom was abolished in almost the entire Rhineland. In most of the states of the Rhine Union, the Napoleonic Civil Code was introduced, which abolished feudal privileges and opened the way for the development of capitalism. The Union of the Rhine participated in the Napoleonic Wars on the side of France. The East Prussian Landwehr goes to war, 1813. Napoleon's unsuccessful campaign in the Russian Empire led to a deep crisis of his empire. On February 27, 1813, the Russian Empire and Prussia signed an alliance treaty in Kalisz. On March 17, 1813, in the city of Breslau, the Prussian King Frederick William III published an appeal to my people, on mein Volk, calling for a fight against Napoleon. The War of Liberation began, which was part of the pan-European war against Napoleon, known as the War of the Sixth Coalition. The most radical strata of German society viewed this war as a step towards realizing the long-standing desire to recreate a single state of the German nation. The German Union. At the Congress of Vienna, October 1814, June 9, 1815, the German Union of 38 German states was formed on June 8, 1815. On June 8, the federal act, Bundesact, was adopted, which played the role of the Union's charter. According to him, the German Union was a confederation of independent states. The supreme body was the Assembly of the Union, Bundesversammlung, whose members were appointed by the monarchs, headed by the President of the Union, Bundespräsident, who was ex officio the Emperor of Austria. The German Union consisted of the states of the Union, Bundesstaat. The introduction of the constitutions of the Union states and their transformation from absolute monarchies into dualistic ones began. In most of the Union states, bicameral legislative bodies were created. The Zemstvo states, Landesstände, the upper, first chambers, of which consisted of the titled nobility. The lower, second chambers, were elected by citizens on the basis of property qualifications. The executive bodies of the Union states, councils of ministers, appointed by the monarchs of the Union states. The Wartburg Festival on October 18th, 1817. During the Napoleonic Wars, German nationalism emerged. Starting with Herder and Fichte, German nationalists believed that Germany was rooted in the ancient German ethnic group, and that the political criteria for inclusion in the nation were insignificant. For example, Fichte, in his Address to the German Nation, 1807, argued that the Germans are characterized by an original language, and the nature of the German character traced back to primitive times, which endows it with a metaphysical national spirit. However, if in the past the history of the German people did not depend on them in many ways, then in the future, according to Fichte, the Germans had to make their own history. This call was taken up by other German philosophers and writers, which led to the rise of Romantic nationalism. A pan-German cultural and political movement was formed. On March 23, 1819, in Mannheim, Karl Sand, a student who belonged to a liberal student fraternity, killed the conservative writer August von Kotzebue. After that, by the decision of the Assembly of the Union, Sejm, adopted on September 20th, 1819, a number of decrees were issued in the states of the German Union, which banned the activities of nationalist fraternities. German, Burschenschaften, ordered the dismissal of all liberal-minded university professors and increased press censorship. In 1830, the July Revolution in France and the uprising in Poland inspired new vigor in the representatives of German liberalism. The spirit of opposition was awakened with unprecedented force. In some places, by violent agitation, and in others, by open indignation, the small German governments were forced to make concessions, while the great powers had their hands tied by the Polish rebellion. Hesse, Brunswick, Hanover, and Saxony received representative assemblies. Freedom of the press was introduced in other states, but some excesses, for example the Gambach holiday, served as a pretext for the governments to intervene vigorously and to cancel the concessions made in 1832 through the Frankfurt Diet. The events that followed, such as the Frankfurt Uprising of 1833, further aggravated the police activities of the Allied Diet. The resolutions of 1834 drawn up at the Vienna conferences were directly directed against individual constitutions. The abolition of the Hanoverian Constitution by King Ernst August in 1837 caused general indignation, especially after the Allied Diet, called upon to defend the Constitution, declared itself incompetent. The Revolution of 1848-1849, Frankfurt National Assembly, the Frankfurt National Assembly. The famous allegorical painting, Germany, by Philip Feith, stands above the chairman's desk. On March 30th, 1848, the Union Assembly called elections to the German National Assembly. Its convocation was one of the results of the March Revolution in the countries of the German Union. Meeting on May 18th of the same year, the Assembly on June 28th, 1848, adopted the imperial law on the creation of the Provisional Central Government of Germany, Reichsgesetz über die Einführung einer provisorischen Zentralgewalt für Deutschland, according to which the German National Assembly was the legislative body, the imperial regent, Reichsverweser, the head of state, the imperial ministry, Reichsministerium, consisting of the imperial the prime minister, Reichsministerpräsident, and the Reich ministers, Reichsminister, as the executive body, are the Reichskommissars, Reichskommissar. Paulskirche Constitution. On March 27, 1849, the First German National Assembly adopted the Imperial Constitution, Reichsverfassung, according to which the Parliament, Reichstag, became the legislative body, consisting of the upper house, Staatenhaus, elected by regional councils, and the lower house, Volkshaus, elected by the people, the head of state, the emperor, Kaiser, the executive body, the government, Reichsregierung, consisting of the Reich ministers, Reichsminister. However, this constitution was rejected by the Union Assembly. The Prussian Union. An attempt at unification in 1849, Prussian King Frederick William III refused to lead the unification of Germany in a revolutionary way from below, but wanted to do it from above, using the influence gained during the suppression of the revolution. In May 1849, he convened a conference at which Saxony and Hanover joined the Federation of the Prussian Union, where Prussia was given foreign policy and military affairs. Under the influence of public sentiment, 29 German states joined the Prussian Union, except Austria, Bavaria, Württemberg, and several other principalities, the Erfurt Union. Austria opposed the Prussian alliance, but after the Revolution of 1848-1849 had no forces for military opposition. Therefore, in September 1849, she concluded an agreement with Prussia on the joint management of German affairs. On May 10, 1850, at the initiative of Austria, the Diet of the German Union, the Frankfurt Diet, was convened, marking the restoration of the former order in the administration of Germany. Prussia did not recognize the Diet. Thus, the two largest German states were heading for an armed conflict, while the rest of the members of the German Union were divided in their sympathies. The confrontation was complicated by the sluggish Prussian-Danish War of Independence in Holstein and the internal conflict in the electorate of Hesse. The Austro-Bavarian Corps, by decision of the Allied Diet, was supposed to suppress unrest in Hesse, but the Prussians did not allow these troops to pass through their territory. On November 8, 1850, Prussian and Bavarian troops clashed near the town of Bronzell near Fulda, in which several people were injured. Tsar Nicholas I intervened in the conflict, forcing Prussia not to interfere with the decisions of the All-German Diet. As a result, Prussia, under military pressure from Austria and Russia, submitted, abandoning the idea of uniting Germany within the framework of the Prussian Union. The chairman of the Prussian cabinet, Manteuffel, announced this to the German sovereigns, who remained faithful to the idea of the Union. According to the Austro-Prussian Agreement, German.R State. On November 29, 1850, Prussia withdrew from interference in the affairs of Hesse and Holstein. That is, it actually abandoned an independent domestic policy. Austria also failed to take advantage of the diplomatic victory over Prussia and strengthen its influence on decision-making on German affairs. The Dresden Conference in December 1850 restored the former norms of relations within the German Union. The North German Union and the Unification of Germany, 1866–1871, the Prussian triumvirate of the 1860s, which transformed Germany in the second half of the 19th century, first into a regional and then into a world great power. From left to right, Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, Prussian Minister of War, Army Reformer, and his closest associate Albrecht von Roon, prominent military scientist, permanent chief of the General Staff, Helmut von Moltke. Meanwhile, the Schleswig-Holstein question appeared on the scene, and with it, new complications that marked the beginning of the complete reconstruction of Germany. Having been defeated in the Danish-Prussian War of 1864, Denmark was forced to abandon Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg in favor of Austria and Prussia. They concluded the Gastein Convention in August 1865, which not only solved the problem of dividing the spoils between Austria and Prussia, but also created a new reason for the war between them. On April 9, 1866, Prussia submitted to the Union Diet a proposal to convene a German parliament, elected by direct and general vote, to discuss a draft reform of the Union Constitution. Prussia agreed to Austria's proposal for mutual disarmament if Austria would cease its armaments against Italy. The peace congress proposed by the neutral powers in Paris did not take place, and in June 1866, the Austro-Prussian War began, in which Prussia's victory prepared the German unification. The result of the Prussian victory was the exclusion of Austria from the German Union, and its consent to the formation of a North German Union under the leadership of Prussia. On August 18, 1866, the Prussian alliance with the North German states, Bündnisvertrag Preußens mit den Norddeutschen Staaten, was signed, according to which Prussia and 17 North German states, 4 more joined them in the fall, committed themselves to enact a law on elections to the interstate parliament. The German Union dissolved on August 23rd, and on October 15, 1866, the Prussian Landtag issued a law on the elections to the Constitutional Reichstag of the North German Union, Wahlgesetz für den konstituierenden Reichstag des Norddeutschen Bundes, according to which the Constitutional Reichstag, konstituierende Reichstag, was convened to adopt an interstate constitution. The elections to which were held on February 12th, it met for its first meeting on February 24th, and on April 16th, 1867, it adopted the North German Federal Constitution, Norddeutsche Bundesverfassung NBV, proclaiming the creation of the North German Union, which was a federal constitutional dualistic monarchy. The legislative body was the Federal Council, Bundesrat, appointed by the monarchs of the states, and the Reichstag, elected by the people on the basis of universal suffrage under the majority system. The head of state was the federal president, Bundespräsident, who was ex officio the King of Prussia. The head of the executive branch was the federal chancellor, Bundeskanzler, appointed by the federal president and responsible to him. The North German Union consisted of federal states, Bundesstaat, each of which had its own constitution and laws. On August 31st, 1867, the first elections to the Reichstag were held. Construction of a locomotive, painting by Paul Friedrich Meyerheim. The peculiarity of the belated Industrial Revolution in Germany was that it was based on domestic engineering, on its own engineering and technical achievements. Huge machine-building enterprises, equipped with the latest equipment, were immediately built in Germany. This is what provided unprecedented rates of industrial production in the 19th century. The middle of the 19th century in Germany was called the era of Gründerism. Gründers, German. Gründer, the founders of the companies. A significant role in this rapid economic development was played by the construction of railways, which became the most significant factor in the economy of this period. Therefore, a typical Gründer is a pioneer of railway transport, like Henry Strausberg's Bethel. The railways provided a major boost to the development of other industries due to the increased demand for coal and steel, which led to the establishment of industrial empires such as the company founded by Friedrich Krupp, the German Empire, 1871–1918, colonies of the German Empire. As a result of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870–1871, Baden and Hesse were admitted to the North German Union on November 15, 1870, and the root Northern was removed from the Union's name. See Unification of Germany, 1871. The German Empire was a federal state that united 22 monarchies, 3 free cities, and the land of Alsace-Lorraine. According to the Constitution, the German Emperor was the King of Prussia. He appointed the Reich Chancellor. The Reichstag was elected by universal suffrage. The empire had a single budget, an imperial bank, an army, a coin, a foreign ministry, a post office, and a railway department. The absence of customs borders, progressive economic legislation, and the French indemnity led to rapid economic growth. Thanks to a well-thought-out system of secondary education and universities, science flourished and technology progressed. The strikes and legislative reforms carried out under the influence of the Social Democratic Party led to an increase in wages and a reduction in social tensions. However, the unprecedented rise of the Gründer era suddenly ended with the major stock market crash of 1873, which led to almost 20 years of stagnation, known as the Gründer crisis. The crisis has called into question the theory of economic liberalism and led to the creation of practical control mechanisms and the introduction of protectionist duties. The mass petty bourgeois and proletarian movements that emerged during this period became clear opponents of liberalism in economics. The crisis dealt the most devastating blow to human psychology. The promises of wealth and prosperity for all were not realized, and the fear of social decline due to competition from industrial production prevailed in the circles of small artisans and entrepreneurs. Conspiracy theories spread rapidly in these circles, and anti-Semitism, which became widespread in the 1880s, gained fertile ground. During the reign of William II, 1888-1918, Germany was late in seizing the colonies and was forced to look for ways to redevelop them. She concluded a triple alliance with Austria-Hungary and Italy. Due to the huge military expenditures, up to half of the entire budget, by 1914 Germany had an army with the best weapons in the world. World War I, 1914-1918. On June 28, 1914, the assassination of the Austrian heir Franz Ferdinand in the city of Sarajevo triggered the outbreak of the First World War. In Germany, the Schlieffen Plan was developed for a rapid offensive against France and its defeat, since Germany was not ready for a protracted war. The plan called for bypassing the Franco-German border and attacking France through Belgium. However, after the occupation of Belgium by Germany, Great Britain declared war on the latter. German troops were able to wedge themselves deep into France, but soon the advance of German troops got bogged down, and Germany had to actively fight on two fronts due to the Russian offensive in East Prussia and its partial occupation by Russian troops. Because of this, the advance into France had to be suspended. Further, the Western Front hardly moved, and a war of attrition began there. Military success was accompanied by Germany on the Eastern Front in 1915, by the German managed to advance deep into Russia and seize its territory, such as Lithuania and Poland. Germany failed to break the French army, and the war in the West entered a protracted positional phase, with heavy human and material losses. Germany gradually bled out, and the entry of the United States into the war accelerated the predetermined outcome, which could no longer be influenced by the Brest-Litovsk peace, which in 1917 Germany concluded with Russia on very favorable terms. On September 26, 1918, the Entente offensive began on the Western Front. Germany's allies were in an extremely difficult situation, and one after another signed an armistice with the Entente, September 29, 1918, Bulgaria, October 30th, Turkey, November 3rd, Austria-Hungary. On October 5, 1918, the German government officially announced Germany's readiness for peace negotiations with the Entente countries and its allies. The events of November 4th, 9th, 1918 pushed even more towards ending the war and concluding peace. When Germany was engulfed by an anti-monarchist uprising, the rebels began to form workers' councils, Arbeiterrat, at the enterprise level. On November 9th, William II fled to the Netherlands, where he soon abdicated, and the German Empire was proclaimed the German Socialist Republic. On November 10, 1918, the Berlin Council decided to create a Provisional Council of People's Representatives, which on November 11, 1918, signed an armistice in Compiègne on the cessation of hostilities by the Imperial German Army and put an end to the First World War. The Weimar Republic, 1919 to 1933, the November Revolution. On November 4th-9th, 1918, an anti-monarchist uprising swept Germany, and the rebels began forming workers' councils, Arbeiterrat, at the enterprise level. On November 9th, the King of Prussia fled to the Netherlands, where he soon abdicated, the German Empire was proclaimed the German Socialist Republic, and on November 10th, the General Assembly of the Berlin Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, Vollversammlung der Berliner Arbeiter- und Soldatenräte, elected provisional government bodies, the Executive Council of Workers' and Soldiers' Councils of Greater Berlin, Vollzugsrat des Arbeiter- und Soldatenrates Groß-Berlin, and the Council of People's Representatives, the latter consisting of representatives of the SPD and the recently left-wing Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. The chairman of the Council of People's Representatives, Vorsitzende des Rates der Volksbeauftragten, were the right-wing Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert and the Independent Social Democrat Hugo Haase. December 16, 1921, 1918. At the last Imperial Congress of Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, it was decided to convene the Second German National Assembly to adopt the Constitution. The Central Council of the German Socialist Republic, Zentralrat der Deutschen Sozialistischen Republik, was elected as a provisional parliament, and the composition of the Council of People's Representatives was approved. Spartacists behind the barricade during the uprising in January 1919, the revolution in Munich 1919. Numerous reforms were carried out, women received voting rights, and an 8-hour working day was introduced. On December 30th, 1918, the Communist Party of Germany was formed, and in January 1919, its supporters, along with members of the left-wing Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, NSDPG, raised an uprising in Berlin. It was suppressed by the Freikorps, and communist leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were killed. However, the revolutionary uprisings in Germany continued. On March 3rd, 1919, the General Meeting of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils of Berlin decided to launch a general strike in the capital in support of mass strikes in central Germany. The strike escalated into fierce street fighting, with up to 1,500 workers and 75 Freikorps killed in the clashes. In some regions of Germany, the communists had temporary success. The Bremen Soviet Republic was proclaimed in Bremen on January 10, 1919. But on February 4, 1919, troops from Berlin were sent to Bremen, and the Soviet Republic fell. On April 6, 1919, the Bavarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed. At first, its Red Army successfully operated against the Freikorps sent to Bavaria by the German government. However, internal disagreements soon arose, and the Bavarian Soviet Republic was liquidated. The actions of the government forces in Bavaria were accompanied by mass terror against the communists and those suspected of sympathizing with them. The Weimar Constituent Assembly main article, the Weimar Constituent Assembly. On January 19, 1919, elections to the Constituent Assembly were held, at which the SPD took the first place, and on February 10, 1919, the law on provisional imperial power was passed, according to which the legislative bodies became the Committee of States, Staatenausschuss, elected by the land governments, and the National Assembly, elected by the people, the head of state. The imperial president, elected by the National Assembly. The executive body is the Reich Ministry, Reichsministerium, appointed by the Reich President, consisting of the Reich Prime Minister, Reichsminister-President, and the Reich Ministers. Until the middle of 1919, all attempts to establish a socialist Soviet republic in Germany were suppressed. The last was the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which fell on May 2, 1919. The Versailles Peace Treaty Germany, after the Treaty of Versailles. Territories under the control of the League of Nations territories, annexed by neighboring countries. The territory of Weimar Germany. On June 28, 1919, in accordance with the Treaty of Versailles, Germany ceded part of the territory and its colonies. The unification of Germany and Austria was banned. Germany and its allies were blamed for starting the war. Germany was also forced to pay reparations. France regained Alsace and Lorraine. The Saarland became subordinate to the League of Nations, and the Rhineland was occupied by the Entente forces and received the status of a demilitarized zone. Significant restrictions were imposed on the German army. The Treaty of Versailles stipulated that the decision on the nationality of some border areas would be taken in referendums. A German bilingual propaganda poster from 1921 calling on the inhabitants of Upper Silesia to vote to remain part of Germany. The text says, "We want a good job and a good income." We miners vote for Germany. After 2 referendums, Schleswig was divided between Germany and Denmark. Northern Schleswig returned to Denmark, while southern Schleswig remained with Germany. After the referendum on July 11, 1920, the districts of Allenstein and Marienwerder remained part of Prussia. On September 20th, Eupen and Malmedy, near Aachen, ceded to Belgium most of the province of Posen to Poland, which regained its statehood, and the German People's Council for West Prussia and West Prussia, Deutscher Volksrat für Westpreußen und Posen, was established in the German-populated part of Posen and West Prussia. The eastern part of West Prussia, as the West Prussian district, was incorporated into East Prussia. The northern part of West Prussia was separated into a separate state. The free city of Danzig, Upper Silesia, after a referendum accompanied by clashes with the use of force, was divided between Germany, province of Upper Silesia, and Poland, autonomous Silesian voivodeship. Memel district became subordinate to the League of Nations, and later in 1923, it was ceded to Lithuania. In 1922, Germany and the RSFSR concluded the Rapallo Treaty on the restoration of diplomatic relations. In January 1923, French troops, in response to delays in the payment of reparations, occupied the Ruhr region, which was the beginning of the so-called Ruhr conflict. The government supported the resistance of local residents to the invaders. Gustav Stresemann, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Weimar Republic, together with his French counterpart Aristide Briand, worked to bring the two countries closer together and revise the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which was reflected in the Locarno Agreements concluded in 1925, and Germany's entry into the League of Nations in 1926. The First Democratic Constitution. On June 30th, 1919, the Second German National Assembly adopted the Constitution of the German Empire, according to which the legislative bodies were the Reich Council, Reichsrat, appointed by the land governments, and the Reichstag, elected on the basis of universal, equal and direct suffrage by secret ballot. The head of state was the Reich President, elected by the people, and the executive body was the imperial government. Reichsregierung, consisting of the Reich Chancellor and imperial ministers, German Reichsminister, appointed by the Reich President and responsible to the Reichstag. The crisis years of 1918-1923, after the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, NSDPG, split off from the SPD in April 1917, a smaller part of the old SPD electorate passed to it, while the majority of the electorate was fixed for the SPD. The German People's Party, BNP, became the successor of the National Liberal Party, and the German Democratic Party, NDP, became the successor of the Progressive People's Party. In the Catholic south of Germany, the Centre Party, PC, remained dominant, recognizing the Republican form of government, while the Land Union in Bavaria broke away from it, forming the Bavarian People's Party, BNP, which advocated federalism. In the Reichstag, the Centre Party and the BNP formed a single faction. The three democratic parties, SPD, NDP, and PC, formed a Weimar coalition among themselves, and if this coalition did not have an absolute majority in parliament, it entered into a grand coalition with the NNP. Communist youth demonstration in Berlin, May 1st, 1925. Horst Wessel at the head of his SA detachment in Nuremberg, 1929. In the northeastern provinces of Prussia, the successor of the German Conservative Party, the German National People's Party, BNP, enjoyed great influence, opposing parliamentarism for the establishment of a strong one-man government, but acting by parliamentary methods. It had a militant organization, the Steel Helmet, and sympathetic positions to the party were held by the Volunteer Corps that existed in the early periods of the Republic. In 1920, the latter attempted to overthrow the Reichstag government, the Kapp Putsch, which ended in failure. The niche of another right-wing German social party, founded in 1889, was occupied by the German Workers' Party, later renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, which also opposed parliamentarism and advocated the establishment of a strong one-man government. The most influential units of the party were the Assault Detachments, SA. On November 8, 1923, in Bavaria, the SA tried to overthrow the power of the Bavarian Landtag, the so-called Beer Hall Putsch, but failed. On December 30th, 1918, the Communist Party of Germany, KKE, split from the NSDPG, advocating the replacement of parliamentarism with a system of workers' councils. It was an avant-garde party that united a relatively small stratum of the working class, built on the basis of production cells. Therefore, the main method of its political action was the organization of strikes, workers' demonstrations, and eventually workers' uprisings. In March 1921, armed demonstrations of communists took place in central Germany. The leadership of the Comintern decided to carry out an armed uprising with the aim of seizing power by the German communists. Another attempt to seize power by the KKE was made in October-November 1923, but was prevented as a result of government actions. Only the communists of Hamburg attempted to capture the city on October 23rd. Their rebellion was suppressed by the troops. Robert Murphy, an American diplomat who worked in Munich in the first half of the 1920s, wrote in his memoirs, "The most terrible thing that I witnessed while I was in Munich was rampant inflation, which devoured the savings of several generations of the most deserving and well-off people, and plunged millions of citizens into a state of hopeless despair." This inflation, in my opinion, more than anything else, contributed to the rise of Hitlerism. The main problem of the KKE in the early years of its existence remained the lack of broad support, but the party had the opportunity to expand it, primarily pro-communist mass organizations that accepted not only communists, but also members of democratic parties who sympathized with the communists on certain issues. The largest of these mass organizations was the Communist Militant Organization, the Union of Red Front Line Soldiers. In December 1920, some members of the NSDPG joined the KKE. On September 24, 1922, another part of the NSDPG joined the SPD, significantly replenishing the ranks of its left wing, which made it possible in the autumn of the following year in Saxony and Thuringia to form coalition cabinets from the SPD and the KKE, but very quickly they were ousted by imperial execution. Between 1919 and 1922, there were at least 354 politically motivated murders by right-wing extremists, mostly members of the Freikorps, and at least 22 murders by left-wing extremists. Compared to murders committed by right-wingers, murders committed by leftists were prosecuted much more frequently and carried significantly harsher penalties. 10 executions, 3 life sentences, and 249 years in prison in total for leftists, compared with 1 life sentence and 90 years in prison for rightists. This is due to the specifics of the legal system of the Weimar Republic, since most of the judges remained from the time of the Kaiser's era, were conservative and held right-wing views. The Golden Twenties, 1924-1929. This section needs to be updated. Please improve and complete the section. January 31st, 2022. During the May Day demonstration in 1929, held by the KKE in defiance of the ban on mass events, Berlin police began shooting at demonstrators, killing 33 people and injuring more than 200. These events became known as Bluthmai, Bloody May. The crisis and agony of the Weimar Republic, 1929 to 1933. This section needs to be updated. Please improve and complete the section. January 31st, 2022. In 1930, the Weimar coalition disintegrated, and the country was led by cabinets of ministers appointed by the Reich president without taking into account the opinion of parliament. The NDP merged with the populist Young German Order, while most of the rank-and-file members of the NDP formed the Radical Democratic Party. Against the background of disillusionment with the party leadership, voters who had previously voted for the Democratic parties are beginning to vote for the NSDAP. In 1931, the right-wing forces of Germany united in the Harzburg Front. After the Reichstag elections on July 31st, 1932, the NSDAP became the largest party in parliament. The top of the PC began to move closer to the NSDAP, which led to attempts to form a coalition with the NSDAP in Prussia, and at the federal level, and criticism of the party leadership within the PC itself. On January 28, 1933, Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher announced his resignation. Nazi Germany, German Reich, Great German Reich, 1933-1945. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of the Reich. This event marked the end of the Weimar Republic, the Great German Reich, and its territorial expansion in Europe. 1938-1943, Potsdam Day. March 20, 1933. Adolf Hitler's bow is intended to demonstrate the Reich Chancellor's submission to President Paul von Hindenburg. Folk festival in connection with the annexation of the Sudetenland to the German Reich. October 3, 1938, the city of Asch. German soldiers and the Landespolizisten, border police, of the Free City of Danzig clean the Polish border crossing in Sopot, September 1st, 1939. The National Socialist state that controlled Germany was called the Third Reich. On February 1st, 1933, the Reichstag was dissolved and re-elections were scheduled. The presidential decree of February 4th, 1933 became the basis for the ban on opposition newspapers and public appearances. Using the arson of the Reichstag as an excuse, mass arrests of communists accused of arson and destabilizing the situation in the country were carried out. Due to the lack of places in prisons, concentration camps were set up. The NSDAP won the Reichstag elections, March 5, 1933. The votes cast for the communists were annulled. The new Reichstag, at its first meeting on March 23rd, retroactively approved Hitler's extraordinary powers. All parties except the National Socialist were liquidated. However, activists of the right-wing parties were not only not arrested, but many of them joined the NSDAP. The trade unions were dissolved, and new ones were created in their place, completely controlled by the government. Strikes were banned, and entrepreneurs were declared the Führers of enterprises. Compulsory labor service was soon introduced, June 30th, 1934. On Hitler's orders, Operation Kolibri, Night of the Long Knives, was carried out, which prevented the impending coup by Ernst Röhm and the SA assault troops under his leadership, and many SA leaders were arrested. Thanks to the end of the Great Depression, the elimination of all opposition and criticism, the elimination of unemployment, propaganda that played on national feelings, and later major territorial gains, bloodless victories in foreign policy before World War II, and subsequent rapid military successes in Europe, Hitler significantly increased his popularity among the electorate and eventually became a central figure all over Germany. In addition, he achieved not only the solution of many economic problems, but also major successes in the German economy. In particular, Germany took the first place in the world in the production of steel and aluminum. The Reich also did not forget about Germans living outside Germany. Within the framework of the adopted National Socialist concept of blood above land, a large-scale campaign was organized to return all foreign Germans, Volksdeutsche, to their homeland. In 1933-1934, an extensive campaign was launched in Germany to provide all possible assistance to Soviet Germans during the famine that broke out in the USSR by collecting and sending food packages and money to the Soviet Union. In 1935, after a plebiscite, the Saarland was returned to German control. In 1936, Germany hosted the Winter Olympic Games in Garmisch-Partenkirchen and the Summer Olympic Games in Berlin. In the same year, 1936, the Anti-Comintern Pact was concluded between Germany and Japan. Italy joined it in 1937, Hungary, Manchukuo, and Spain in 1939. On November 9, 1938, a Jewish pogrom known as Kristallnacht was organized. Starting from that time, mass persecution and arrests of Jews began in Germany. A part of the intelligentsia, mostly of Jewish nationality, decided to emigrate abroad. In March 1938, Austria was annexed to Germany. In October, the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. And in March 1939, after the occupation of the entire Czech Republic, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was established on its territory. World War II, 1939-1945. The causes and prerequisites of the Second World War are a long chain of eventful vicissitudes, political intricacies, and relationships between the great powers of the world at that time. As a result, on September 1st, 1939, under the pretext of Polish border violations and an alleged Polish attack on the Gleiwitz radio station, the German Wehrmacht troops were ordered to cross the Polish border. On the same day, Slovakia began military operations against Poland on the German side. On September 3rd, Great Britain and France, in accordance with their commitments to Poland, declared war on Germany. They were followed by the countries of the British Commonwealth of Nations, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and India. On the same day, the US president declared his country's neutrality in this European conflict. On September 17th, Soviet troops invaded Poland from the east, under the pretext of protecting the indigenous populations of western Ukraine and western Belarus, in accordance with the previously concluded secret protocol between Germany and the USSR on the delimitation of spheres of influence in Europe. The Second World War began. By June 1941, Germany and Western Europe had occupied Austria, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the western territories of divided Poland, and had defeated France by occupying part of its territory. Germany managed to radically change the strategic situation in Europe, withdraw France from the war, and expel the British army from the continent. However, during the subsequent Battle of Britain, German aviation failed to achieve the air supremacy necessary to conduct an amphibious operation on the British Isles. In the spring of 1941, Germany was forced to occupy Yugoslavia due to the coup d'etat that took place there, and urgently save the situation of its Italian allies in Greece. In fact, these forced military operations in the Balkans delayed for about 2 months the planned invasion of the USSR by the armed forces of the European coalition of the Axis countries, which by June 1941, in addition to Germany, they came in: Italy, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Croatia, and Finland. Thus, these 2 months of postponement of Operation Barbarossa turned out to be absolutely life-saving for the USSR. The date of the attack on the Soviet Union was postponed to June 22, 1941, Note 1. On June 27, 1941, German troops crossed the border of the Soviet Union and occupied a significant part of its European territory by December 1941. To save the situation of their Italian allies in Africa, the German expeditionary forces appeared on the African continent, and in December 1941, Germany and the United States declared war on each other. The fire of World War II continued to flare up, taking on an increasingly uncertain and protracted character. From the very beginning of the war, there was a growing shortage of labor in Germany. In all the occupied territories, freelance workers were recruited to work in Germany. Due to the fact that the war eventually took on a protracted character, forced recruitment of workers, the so-called Fremdarbeiters, Zwangsarbeiters, civil workers, and Ostarbeiters began to be carried out in European and Slavic territories. The number of concentration camps, death camps, and prisoner of war camps was growing in Germany and some occupied territories. Due to the protracted nature of the war and the growth of the guerrilla and liberation movement, a regime of total terror and intimidation of the population was established in the occupied eastern territories. Gradually, due to the protracted war, the tightening of the regime in the occupied European countries led to the fact that liberation resistance movements and guerrilla warfare began to unfold there, gaining ever greater proportions. Hamburg after the bombings in July and August 1943. Photo from Martin Middlebrook's book, The Battle for Hamburg. Since the beginning of the war, managerial chaos began to spread in the German state apparatus, caused by the bureaucratization of the state apparatus, which increased with the seizure of new territories, the need to organize their management, and the ever-increasing complexity of the military situation, when Germany eventually entered into a military confrontation with the 3 most powerful economic powers in the world: Great Britain, the USA, and the USSR, which possessed not only vast geographical the size of territories, taking into account both metropolises and colonial possessions, protectorates and dominions, but also with significant human resources and economic resources of minerals that were available in these territories. Germany's main bet on a possible victory over the enemy was precisely on a short-lived victorious blitzkrieg. A protracted war of attrition became a big problem for the German economy, despite the fact that the pace of economic capacity and production of all types of weapons by the end of the war was constantly increasing. Their peak was in 1944, and despite the most advanced scientific achievements and the most advanced types of weapons created by Germany, in comparison with their opponents, both in small arms and tanks, both in naval technologies, especially in the submarine fleet, as in aviation, including jet, and ending with the completely revolutionary military rocket science, which was about to combine its achievements with developments in the German atomic project. In the summer of 1943, the Italo-German forces suffered a final defeat in Africa, and their remnants were forced to capitulate in Tunisia, after which Anglo-American troops landed on the Italian islands and in mainland Italy. A year later, on June 6, 1944, Anglo-American forces landed in Normandy, opening a full-fledged second front against Germany in Europe. After that, on July 20, 1944, a number of German senior officers attempted an unsuccessful anti-Hitler coup, with an attempt on Hitler's life. The conspiracy was defeated, and many of its participants were arrested and executed. In 1944, food shortages began to be felt by German citizens. The aircraft of the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition bombed the cities. Hamburg and Dresden were almost completely destroyed. Due to the heavy losses of personnel of the German armed forces, the Volkssturm militia was created in October 1944 to mobilize the entire male population aged 16 to 60 years who were not in military service. Werewolf detachments began to form for future guerrilla and sabotage activities in the event of occupation of the territory of the Reich by enemy troops. On March 7, 1945, the U.S. Army occupied Cologne. On March 29th, Frankfurt am Main. On April 9th, the USSR Armed Forces took Königsberg. On April 21, 1945, units of the Fighting France occupied Stuttgart. On April 30th, 1945, the U.S. Army occupied Munich. On May 2, 1945, the USSR Army occupied Berlin. 2 days before that, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide, and a new German government was created in Flensburg according to his will. On May 3, 1945, the British Army occupied Hamburg, and on May 6th, the Soviet Armed Forces occupied Breslau, Message. On May 8, 1945, the Act of Surrender of the German Armed Forces to the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition was signed. On May 23, 1945, the Flensburg government of Karl Dönitz was arrested by the Anglo-American Occupation Administration, thereby ending the legal existence of the Great German Reich. Divided Germany, 1945-1990. The occupation of Germany, 1945-1949. The division of Germany and Austria into occupation zones after World War II. After Germany was defeated in World War II in May 1945, it was occupied by the troops of the USSR, France, the United States, and Great Britain. The current composition of the imperial government, led by Nazi Schwerin von Krosigk, was arrested on May 23, 1945, and its functions were transferred to the Inter-Allied Control Council, Alliierter Kontrollrat. The territory of Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, Mecklenburg, Brandenburg, Thuringia; British, Lower Saxony, North Rhine-Westphalia, Hamburg, Schleswig-Holstein; American, Bavaria, Hesse, Bremen, Württemberg-Hohenzollern; and French, Baden, Rhineland-Palatinate, Württemberg-Baden. The occupation zones were managed by zonal military administrations, which had the main authority. The time of the creation of this provisional government and the date of the all-German parliamentary elections have not been determined. Berlin, although it was located on the territory of the Soviet zone, but as the city in which the Allied Control Council was located, it was allocated to a special unit controlled by the Inter-Allied Commandant's Office, Alliierte Kommandantur. Peacetime immediately after the end of the Second World War. The year 1945. Immediately after the occupation, a political quarantine was declared in all occupation zones except the Soviet one. All political parties that did not exist except the NSDAP were banned. Therefore, only the NSDAP and anti-fascist committees were banned in the Soviet occupation zone. Only the NSDAP. On June 10, 1945, political parties and trade unions were allowed in the Soviet occupation zone, and in the fall in other zones, as a result of which the pre-war German parties, the KKE, the SPD, the NDP, and the Human Rights Center, and the Trade Union Center, the Union of Free German Trade Unions, SSNP, were restored. However, soon the top of the NDP party, together with former members of the NNP, create the Free Democratic Party of Germany, FDP. In the Soviet occupation zone, the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, and the top of the PC party, together with former members of the NNP, create the Christian Democratic Union, CDU, as a result of which the NDP and the PC are marginalized. In the Soviet occupation zone, an attempt is being made to recreate the semblance of the Weimar Coalition, which leads to the creation of a democratic bloc, which includes the KKE, the SPD, the LDP, and the East German CDU, whose governing body was formed on the basis of the parity of all parties in the bloc. Similar blocs were created at the land level, and temporary land assemblies were formed on a parity basis between these parties, which also included representatives of some public organizations. In the same year, an inter-party youth organization of all four parties, the Free German Youth, Freie Deutsche Jugend, was formed. In April 1946, the SPD and the KKE in the Soviet occupation zone merged into the Socialist United Party of Germany, SED, whose governing bodies were formed on the basis of parity between former communists and social democrats. The SPD of the other three zones refused such an association. The organizations of the SED of these zones became the organizations of the KKE. In 1946-1947, the land and district assemblies and community councils, or community representations, elected by the population are being recreated, and in the elections to them in the Soviet occupation zone, in which the KKE and the SPD were united into the SED won the majority. In the rest, either the SPD or the CDU received the majority. The USSR also insisted on holding elections to the German National Assembly, but this decision was rejected. Back in October 1946, U.S. Renaissance representatives raised the issue of creating pan-German administrative departments, proto-ministries, provided for in the Potsdam Agreements, which France opposed. Then in November 1945, the United States proposed the creation of regional administrative departments, but the USSR did not agree to this. On May 25, 1946, the United States demanded this from the USSR again, and in response to the refusal, they stopped supplying military equipment for reparations. In response to the latter, the USSR stopped supplying raw materials from its zone. In September 1946, the General Administrative Council and administrative departments for the American and British zones were established. These bodies showed their inefficiency due to the weak coordination of actions between them, so on May 29, 1947, the Economic Council of the United Economy, Wirtschaftsrat des Vereinigten Wirtschaftsgebietes, was established, elected by the Landtags and the Land Council, Länderrat, elected by the land governments, which together essentially became the provisional parliament of these zones, and the Administrative Council, Verwaltungsrat, formed by the Economic Council. The CDU of the Western zones received a majority in these bodies, as well as the German Supreme Court of the United Economic Union, Deutsches Obergericht für das Vereinigte Wirtschaftsgebiet, thus creating a quasi-parliament that was not directly elected. This step was regarded by some of the society as an attempt to replace the parliament with the Economic Council and postpone the parliamentary elections to a more distant time. This opinion was shared by the Soviet Occupation Administration. Therefore, one of the parties of the Soviet Occupation Zone, SED, took the initiative for all deputies of all Landtags, since the latter were directly elected by the people, to form an all-German proto-parliament. This proto-parliament began its work on December 6, 1947, and was named the German People's Congress, Deutscher Volkskongress. It included almost all representatives of the Landtags of the Soviet occupation zone and 650 deputies from other zones. A total of 2,215 deputies entered the Congress. To represent Germany's interests, the People's Congress appointed a 17-member delegation to the London session of the Council of Foreign Ministers, which was held from November 25th to December 15th, 1947, at which the future fate of Germany was to be decided, but it was not allowed to attend the conference. The session itself ended in failure, and on February 23, 1948, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States having also invited representatives from Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, gathered for a meeting at which it was decided to create a parliamentary council, Parlamentarische Rat, a body elected by the Landtags to adopt the constitution. On June 3, 1948, as a result of the unification of the French zone of occupation of Germany with Bizonia, which had previously, since December 6 in 1946, united the American and British zones of occupation of Germany, Trizonia was created. Berliners are watching the landing of the Raisin bomber. The year is 1948. After the Allies carried out monetary reform in their occupation zone on June 20th, 1948, replacing the old depreciated Reichsmark with a new mark, the Soviet occupation authorities, in turn, carried out a similar monetary reform in the Eastern Zone on June 23, 1948. Since the economic ideologies of the victorious countries radically diverged, the Soviet occupation authorities closed the borders, thereby completely blocking West Berlin, which was located inside the Soviet occupation zone. The Western Allies organized an air bridge through which American and British transport aircraft supplied the city's population. The blockade of West Berlin lasted a year. At a meeting of the minister-presidents of the 11 lands of the Western occupation zone, held from July 8 to 10, 1948 in Koblenz, it was decided not to create a full-fledged state on the territory of Trizonia, which could finally consolidate the partition of Germany. Instead, it was decided to create a temporary state unit, which in no case should have the character of a state. For this reason, it was decided to adopt the Basic Law instead of the Constitution, German Verfassung, Grundgesetz, which would ensure uniform administration of the Western occupation zones, and instead of a constitutional assembly, convene a parliamentary council. For the same reason, the holding of a vote on the approval of the law in a national referendum was fundamentally rejected. Although the Western occupying powers from the very beginning advocated the adoption of a full-fledged constitution through a referendum, the minister-presidents were able to defend their point of view. The Parliamentary Council began its work on September 1, 1948 in Bonn. This decision was not recognized by the USSR, and the representative from the USSR resigned from the Control Council. Immediately after the start of the German People's Congress, committees for unity and a just peace began to organize themselves, first at the cantonal level, later holding district and land people's congresses for unity and a just peace, and such committees began to be created at the district and land levels. On March 17, 1948, the Land Congresses for Unity and a Just World elected delegates to the German Congress for Unity and a Just World, which proclaimed itself the Second German People's Congress and founded the People's Movement for Unity and a Just World, Volksbewegung für Einheit und gerechten Frieden, NDSM. The coordinating body of the movement was elected, the German People's Council, which was chaired by the chairman of the SED, Wilhelm Pick, and the Constitutional Committee, Verfassungsausschuss, which received the necessary resources from the movement to conduct a nationwide discussion of the draft constitution, and the chairman of this committee was another chairman of the SED, Otto Grotewohl. The German People's Council scheduled a consultative referendum on German unity for May 15 to 16, simultaneously with the primaries of the delegates to the Third Congress of the NDSM, in which 66% voted for unity. Voting on both issues was carried out by one ballot. Federal Republic of Germany, 1949-1990. On May 8, 1949, the Parliamentary Council sent its draft constitution, the Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany, for ratification by the Landtags. This Basic Law established the Bundesrat, the Bundestag as legislative bodies, the office of the Federal President as head of state, and the federal government as the executive body. On May 12th, this project was approved by 3 occupation administrations. By May 23rd, all the lands of the Western zones except Bavaria had ratified the Bonn Draft Constitution, and on May 23rd, the Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany entered into force on the territory of these zones. In the Bundestag elections on August 14, 1949, the CDU and its Bavarian ally, the Christian Social Union, CSU, took first place, the SPD, second, the FDP, third. The CDU, CSU, FDP and the German Party formed a coalition among themselves. The government was led by Christian Democrat Konrad Adenauer. who was replaced in 1963 by former Economy Minister Ludwig Erhard, and in 1966 by former Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg Kurt Kiesinger. In 1949, the Association of German Trade Unions was founded. Tank standoff at Checkpoint, Charlie, October 1961. On October 27, 1950, CDU MP Theodore Blank was appointed Commissioner of the Federal Government for issues related to the strengthening of the Allied occupation forces. The task of Blank's department was to develop the structure of the future West German Army, mobilization, and operational plans. In response, the SED and the KKE announced a consultative referendum on militarization and the conclusion of a peace treaty, in which the majority voted against militarization and in favor of a peace treaty. On March 10, 1952, the Soviet government proposed to begin drafting a peace treaty with Germany. The USSR was ready to agree to the unification of the country, to allow the existence of the German army, the military industry, and the free activity of democratic parties and organizations, but on condition that Germany did not participate in military blocs. In 1952, the United States, Great Britain, and the federal government signed a general treaty and the Paris Agreements, according to which the United States and Great Britain retained the right to keep troops in Germany and provided for the creation of a European defense community. In 1954, the SED and the KKE put the issue of the European defense community to a consultative referendum in which the majority voted against it. In 1954, the General Treaty was rejected by the French Parliament and the creation of the European Defence Community did not take place. But in the same year, agreements were signed in Paris, according to which the occupation regime was lifted on the territory of Germany and its state sovereignty was restored. In 1955, the Bundeswehr was created and Germany joined NATO. In the same year, diplomatic relations were established between the USSR and Germany, after which the Berlin government renounced its claims to pan-German status. In 1956, the KKE was banned in Germany. In 1957, an attempt was made to create a confederation of the GDR and the Federal Republic of Germany, with the State Council as the coordinating body. This attempt was supported by both the government of the GDR and the SPD in Germany, but the ruling CDU at that time actually opposed it. In 1957, mandatory conscription into the Bundeswehr was introduced, and the Hallstein Doctrine came into force, which provided for the automatic severance of diplomatic relations with any country that recognized the GDR. In response, the USSR and the GDR demanded that the occupation forces withdraw from West Berlin and turn it into a free, demilitarized city. These requirements were not met, and in 1961, the border between West and East Berlin was closed. France tried to separate the Saarland from Germany, but in the end, according to the Luxembourg Treaty of 1956, the Saarland was reunited with Germany. Volkswagen Beetle has become a symbol of the German economic miracle. To restore the German economy after World War II, the concept of a social market economy was developed. Thanks to its implementation and the help of the Americans under the Marshall Plan, rapid economic growth, the German economic miracle, was achieved in the 1950s, which lasted until 1965 May's. To meet the need for cheap labor, Germany supported the influx of migrant workers, mainly from Turkey. In 1969, the parliamentary elections were won by the coalition of the SPD and the FDP. The government was headed by the former mayor of West Berlin, Willy Brandt, and after his resignation as a result of the scandal in 1974, Helmut Schmidt, who had previously served as finance minister. They recognized the inviolability of post-war borders, weakened emergency legislation, and carried out a number of social reforms. After the FDP withdrew from the coalition with the SPD, and the formation of a coalition between the CDU, CSU, and the FDP, the government was led by former Rhineland-Palatinate Prime Minister Helmut Kohl. On June 2, 1967, at a demonstration against the visit of the Iranian Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to Berlin, a student, Benno Onsorg, was killed by police. On April 11, 1968, the leader of the student movement, Rudi Dutschke, was fatally wounded in an assassination attempt. Following this, protest demonstrations took place in many West German cities, some of which turned into street battles with the police. In these Easter riots, 2 people were killed in Munich, and about 400 people were injured across the country. The assassination attempt on Duchka and the events of May 1968 in France intensified the radicalization of the movement, which at the same time increasingly began to divide into currents. After the 1968 movement, Andreas Boder and Ulrike Meinhof founded the terrorist organization Red Army Faction, German Rote Armee Fraction RAF. West Berlin, 1945-1990. Demonstration against the Vietnam War in West Berlin, 1968. Since 1945, Berlin has been divided between the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition into 4 occupation zones. The Eastern Zone, occupied by Soviet troops, later became the capital of the German Democratic Republic. In the 3 Western Zones, control was carried out, respectively, by the occupation authorities of the United States, Great Britain, and France. After the formation of the Federal Republic of Germany and the GDR, both states declared their claims to sovereignty over West Berlin. With the conclusion of the Quadrilateral Agreement on September 3, 1971, the ratio of West Germany, West Berlin, East Germany, was put on a new legal basis. The occupation regime remained in West Berlin. In 1990, West Berlin became part of a united Germany. German Democratic Republic, 1949-1990. The German Democratic Republic. May Day demonstration in Berlin. The Congress of the NDESM, Three German People's Congress, held on May 15 and 16, 1949, put forward its draft constitution, the Constitution of the German Democratic Republic. This constitution established the Land Chamber, Länderkammer, and the People's Chamber as legislative bodies, the office of the President as head of state, and the government as the executive body. At the same time, unlike the Bonn Basic Law, the Berlin Constitution established the possibility of submitting laws to a referendum. On October 7, 1949, the German People's Council put into effect its draft constitution proposed by the Third German People's Congress, proclaimed itself the Provisional People's Chamber, established the Provisional Chamber of Lands and the Provisional Government, and elected a president. On October 12th, the administrative functions of the German Economic Commission were transferred to the Provisional Government, and on November 11, 1949, the SMEG was transformed into the Soviet Control Commission. The Constitution and this decision were recognized by the Soviet Occupation Administration and all lands of the Soviet occupation zone. On January 7, 1950, the NDESM was reorganized into the National Front for Democratic Germany, NDFDG, whose collective members included all political parties of the Soviet occupation zone, which from the same year began to put up a single and unique list of candidates for the elections to the East German Parliament, which were held on October 19th. Thus, 2 constitutions began to operate in Germany, claiming to be valid throughout Germany. 2 parliaments, 2 presidents, and 2 governments claiming to be binding on their decisions throughout Germany, which gave the NFDG and its collective members a reason to ignore the Bonn Constitution in the Western lands and hold consultative referendums in them. The Socialist United Party of Germany occupied a dominant position in the GDR. Its leading role was enshrined in the Constitution. But 4 other parties existed alongside it for decades. The USSR removed machinery and equipment from the Soviet occupation zone and levied reparations from the GDR. It was only by 1950 that industrial production in the GDR reached the level of 1936. The events of June 17, 1953 in the GDR led to the fact that instead of collecting reparations, the USSR began to provide economic assistance to the GDR. On January 18, 1956, the People's Chamber of the GDR passed a law on the creation of the National People's Army on the basis of pre-existing units of the so-called Barracks People's Police, Kasernierte Volkspolizei. The latter existed in 1948-1956 as the predecessor of the army. Formally, the GDR did not have the right to create an armed force. The pace of economic development in the GDR was lower than in Germany and the lowest among the Warsaw Pact states. Nevertheless, the standard of living in the GDR was noticeably higher than in the Soviet Union and was one of the highest among Eastern European countries, although it was absolutely incomparable with that in Germany. By the 1980s, the GDR had become a highly developed industrial country with intensive agriculture. In terms of industrial output, the GDR ranked 6th in Europe. However, at the same time, in the early 1980s, the country was twice close to bankruptcy, and only loans from Germany saved it from this. By the end of the 1980s, planned economy, extensive economy, lack of natural resources, huge debt, short-sightedness and narrow-mindedness of Stalinist politicians, and a number of other important factors led the GDR to collapse. United Germany since 1990. Alexanderplatz, November 4th, 1989. The Berlin Wall with Germans climbing it against the background of the Brandenburg Gate C. Also, peaceful revolution in the GDR. Gorbachev's reforms in the USSR were perceived by the authorities of the GDR with great caution, and in Germany they aroused great enthusiasm. In 1989, tensions in the GDR began to rise. In the fall, Erich Honecker, the country's longtime leader, resigned from his post as the top party leader, and Egon Krenz, the former leader of the Union of Free German Youth, who led the GDR for several weeks, took his place. In early November, mass demonstrations began in Berlin, eventually leading to the opening of the Berlin Wall. This was the first step towards the unification of the two German states. Soon, the German mark of the Federal Republic of Germany entered into circulation on the territory of the GDR. And in August 1990, an agreement on the establishment of unity was signed between the two sides. On October 3, 1990, the Federal Republic of Germany and the GDR merged, and the GDR became part of the Federal Republic of Germany and ceased to exist. Since 1995, the word Germany has been in the nominative case in the full name of the country in Russian. In the 1990 elections to the United Parliament, the CDU won the majority of mandates, while Kohl remained at the head of the government. Since the unification, the Bundeswehr has participated in a number of peacekeeping and disaster relief operations abroad. From 2002 to 2014, Germany took part in the war in Afghanistan, which led to the first German casualties in combat since World War II. In the 1998 parliamentary elections, the SPD won the majority, and the government was led by former Prime Minister of Lower Saxony, Social Democrat Gerhard Schröder. The 2005 parliamentary elections did not bring a majority to either party. The SPD and the CDU-CSU coalition received approximately equal numbers of votes. Following the election, Angela Merkel, a CDU female representative, became Chancellor of Germany for the first time. The ministerial portfolios were distributed approximately equally between the CDU, CSU, and the SPD. Having prepared well for the global crisis in 2008, Germany was reluctant to finance the affected countries. After the accident at the Fukushima 1 nuclear power plant, the German public opposed the operation of nuclear power in Germany. In response, Merkel announced plans to shut down all of Germany's nuclear power plants over the next decade and rely even more heavily on wind and other alternative energy sources in addition to coal and natural gas. In 2015, Germany was affected by the migration crisis in Europe, as it became the final destination for people from Africa and the Middle East. The country has hosted more than 1 million refugees and migrants and developed a quota system that redistributed migrants across federal lands, depending on their tax income and existing population density. Merkel's decision to allow unrestricted entry has drawn sharp criticism both in Germany and in Europe. On December 8, 2021, Angela Merkel resigned after 16 years as Chancellor. Olaf Scholz, a member of the Social Democratic Party, was elected as the new Chancellor. On May 6, 2025, Friedrich Merz replaced Olaf Scholz as Chancellor,